There are moments in history that exist only because someone chose not to turn back. Moments suspended on the edge of a decision so quiet, so interior, so entirely invisible to everyone in the surrounding room that the world never knows how close it came to a different version of itself. John Lennon stood at the edge of one of those moments on a cold evening in late 1961. He was 21 years old. Outside a venue in Liverpool, he stood on a pavement still damp from earlier rain, coat collar up, hands in his pockets, looking at a door he was not sure he wanted to walk through. The band was inside, the audience was inside, everything that was supposed to happen that night was already in motion without him. And for a stretch of time that no one who knew him then could have predicted, because John Lennon was not, by reputation or by temperament, a man who hesitated. He simply stood there, motionless, caught between something he could not name and a life he was not entirely sure he had chosen rather than fallen into. What was happening inside him in those minutes on the pavement would take years to understand, even for John himself, but the story of why he almost didn't walk through that door begins much earlier. It begins in the accumulated weight of everything the years before that night had cost him. By late 1961, John Lennon had been playing music publicly for 5 years. 5 years of church halls and backyard rehearsals and small Liverpool venues where the audiences talked through the sets and the pay, when there was pay, barely covered the cost of getting there. 5 years of Aunt Mimi's persistent, weary concern, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been right about the practical difficulties and was finding no satisfaction in it. 5 years of watching the world proceed with its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the fact that he was doing something that felt, in his most private moments, like the only real thing he had ever done. He had lost his mother, Julia, in 1958, struck by a car near her home when John was 17. The grief that followed was not the kind that announced itself clearly. It went underground, the way deep grief often does in people who have learned early that the world does not reliably hold you if you show it how badly you are shaking. It came out instead in his music, in the sharp edges of his humor, in the quality of controlled ferocity that appeared in his performances on the nights when the music was going well and he could stop thinking long enough to simply feel. The Quarrymen had become the Beatles. The name settled after a series of iterations that reflected the band's own uncertainty about what it was trying to be. John, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Pete Best had spent significant stretches of 1960 and 1961 in Hamburg, playing marathon sets in clubs that catered to crowds interested primarily in volume and energy rather than artistry. The Hamburg residencies had made them tight, professional, formidable in ways that Liverpool audiences were only beginning to recognize. They had also been exhausting in a way that accumulated rather than resolved, the kind of tiredness that is not about sleep but about the slow compression of living entirely for something without knowing whether that something will ever amount to what you need it to. By the autumn of 1961, John was carrying all of this, the grief, the exhaustion. The 5 years. The specific, grinding uncertainty of someone who has committed entirely to a path without any guarantee that the path leads anywhere. And underneath all of it, this is the part that is hardest to articulate, because John himself rarely articulated it directly. There was a fear. Not the fear of failure in the abstract sense that the word usually implies, something more specific. The fear that the music, which was the most honest thing about him, the thing that connected directly to whatever was most real inside him, might not be enough, that he could give everything he had and the world might simply not respond, that the hum he had always carried, the persistent low-frequency certainty that he was meant for something larger, might turn out to be a story he had been telling himself, privately and without evidence, since childhood. That fear does not disappear when you walk onto a stage. It waits in the wings, and on a cold evening in late 1961, standing on a damp Liverpool pavement outside a venue where the Beatles were scheduled to perform, it had followed John outside. The venue that night was not glamorous. It was the kind of Liverpool club that existed in the early 1960s in the space between ambition and economics, small enough to feel like a rehearsal for something larger, crowded enough on the right nights to generate a heat and noise that suggested possibility. The audience assembling inside was a mix of regulars and curious newcomers, people who had heard something about this band and wanted to see for themselves, and people who were simply there because the alternative was a cold Tuesday night doing nothing. Paul McCartney was already inside, So was George Harrison. Pete Best was behind his. Kit, the set was supposed to begin in 20 minutes, and John was standing on the pavement outside as if the door to the venue was a question he had not yet answered. He had come this far down the streets of Liverpool, through the ordinary motion of getting ready and traveling to a gig, through all the automatic preparations that a working musician performs without thinking because thinking would slow everything down. He had come this far, and then, at the last moment, something had stopped him. It was not a decision exactly. It was more like a pause that became extended enough to start resembling one. He stood with the noise of the city around him, the distant traffic, the cold, the smell of the damp pavement, and he was very quiet inside in a way that was unusual for him. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about 5 years of small venues and indifferent crowds. He was thinking about Aunt Mimi's face when he came home late from gigs and she was still awake, not because she had waited up, but because she could not sleep for worrying about a future she could not see clearly. He was thinking about Hamburg and the marathon nights and the way exhaustion eventually hollows you out until you are performing from something that is deeper than energy, something more fundamental that either holds or doesn't. He was thinking, what if it doesn't hold? No one came out to find him. That detail matters. Paul did not appear in the doorway wondering where he was. No manager, no bandmate, no well-meaning friend came to the pavement to offer the kind of brisk encouragement that might have resolved the moment efficiently. John stood there alone with the question, which meant that whatever answer emerged would have to come from inside him rather than from outside reassurance. He thought about Julia. Not about her death. He had a discipline, hard-won and fragile, around not letting that particular thought take hold before a performance. He thought about her alive. The way she played banjo in the sitting room without caring whether she was any good. The way she laughed at her own mistakes and kept playing. The way she treated music not as a goal to be achieved, but as a condition of being, something you did because the alternative, the silence, was not actually available to someone built the way she was built. He thought about what she had given him. Not only the guitar and the chords, though those had been real gifts, something less tangible and more durable. The understanding that music was not a performance of competence for the approval of others, it was something prior to approval, something that existed because it needed to, because the person doing it needed it to exist. The fear that had followed him outside, the fear that he might give everything and the world might not respond, was, he realized standing on that pavement, the wrong question. It was measuring music against an external verdict, asking the world to confirm something that did not require confirmation. Julia had never asked the banjo to confirm anything. She had simply played. He was not entirely sure that was sufficient reasoning. He was 21 and tired and carrying more than any single evening should ask a person to carry. But it was enough to move him, just barely, just enough. He walked through the door. What happened inside that venue on that particular night is not part of any famous account. It was not a night that historians circled, not a performance that eyewitnesses described to journalists decades later as the moment they knew. It was, by all available evidence, an ordinary good night, the kind that bands have dozens of in the course of a working life. Nights when the music is solid and the crowd responds, and the internal machinery runs cleanly without revealing its own complexity. But something was different in John's performance that night, though the difference would have been invisible to most of the people in the room. Those who knew him well, George, might have noticed a quality in his voice that appeared on the nights when he was performing from the deepest place rather than the surface, a rawness that was not technical but essential. The sound of someone who has just decided something and is singing from the other side of that decision. He sang that night as if it was the last time he would be allowed to. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatically expressive performer in the theatrical sense, but with a completeness, a commitment to the full emotional range of every song that made the ordinary material of a working band set feel like something more than entertainment. It made it feel necessary. The crowd responded. Not with the hysteria that would come later, that was still a year away, still around the corner of a meeting with Brian Epstein and a recording contract and a world that had not yet been introduced to what was about to happen to it, but with the specific quality of attention that audiences give to performers who are fully present, who are not going through the motions but are actually genuinely in the room. And John felt it, the response coming back at him from the dark beyond the stage lights, not validation, because he had decided on the pavement that he was done needing validation, but connection. the thing Julia had always known music was actually for. Brian Epstein first saw the Beatles perform at the Cavern Club in November 1961, just weeks after that cold evening on the pavement. He would later describe the experience in terms that echoed what had happened inside John on that night outside the venue, the sense of encountering something that was not performing for approval, but simply was what it was, completely and without apology, and daring anyone in the room to look away. Epstein became their manager. The path that followed, the recording contract with EMI, the release of Love Me Do in October 1962, the improbable and then inevitable avalanche of what the world came to call Beatlemania, moved with a velocity that left very little room for the kind of pavement standing that John had done in late 1961, but he had done it. He had stood on the pavement and felt the fear and thought about his mother and made the only decision that was really available to someone built the way he was built, the decision to walk through the door. And the version of John Lennon who walked through that door, the one who had just spent however many minutes alone with his own fear and come out the other side, was subtly but consequentially different from the one who had stood outside it. He had tested the foundation and found that it held, not because the world had confirmed it, because he had confirmed it himself alone in the cold with no one watching. The years that followed were extraordinary by any measure. The Beatles rewrote the architecture of popular music not once but several times, album by album refusing to be the thing the world had just decided they were, always ahead of the consensus, always pulling toward the next horizon before the current one had finished resolving. John's voice was at the center of it, the instrument that was capable of tenderness and aggression and irony and raw exposure sometimes within the same song, the voice that made people feel they were hearing something honest even when the subject was abstract or surreal. He wrote songs that became part of the permanent furniture of human experience, words and melodies that entered the language the way very few things do, that became available to people as a way of articulating what they were feeling at moments when their own words were not sufficient. He wrote them from the same place he had always written from, the interior space where the fear lived alongside the music, where the loss of Julia sat alongside the joy of creation, where the public voice and the private person occupied the same body without ever fully resolving their differences. Fame arrived at a scale that no one in the Beatles had genuinely anticipated, despite the ambition that had always been present. John handled it the way he handled most difficult things, with a surface of sharp humor and controlled confidence that protected something more vulnerable underneath. The performance of certainty was itself a kind of honesty. He had learned on a pavement in 1961 that certainty had to be performed sometimes before it could be felt, that the act of walking through the door was itself how you discovered whether the door was worth walking through. He was not always at peace with the life that followed. There were years of real turbulence, creative disagreements, personal losses, the slow dissolution of the Beatles, the complicated navigation of a public identity that had become so large it threatened to swallow the actual person. But through it all, the music remained. The hum that had always been there, low and persistent and unignorable, continued to sound. It came out in Imagine, in Working Class Hero, in Love, in the songs that were most directly confessional and therefore most likely to last. In 1980, settled in New York City with Yoko Ono and their son Sean, John gave a series of interviews that were, in retrospect, among the most reflective of his career. He spoke about the early years in Liverpool with a warmth that surprised some of the journalists who had expected either nostalgia or detachment. He spoke about his mother. He spoke about the Hamburg residencies and what they had demanded and what they had given back. He did not speak about the pavement. That particular evening had not crystallized in his memory into a story he told. It was too ordinary in its outward appearance to have fixed itself into anecdote. The crisis it contained had been entirely interior, and interior crises rarely make good stories unless they lead to dramatic outward events, which this one had not. It had led only to walking through a door, which was, in its own quiet way, everything. He was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, outside his home at the Dakota Building in New York. He was 40 years old. The world he left behind was permanently different from the one he had entered. The music he had made, beginning in backyard rehearsals and Liverpool venues and Hamburg Clubs and a moment on a damp pavement when he had almost turned around continued to play. It continues to play now. It will continue beyond now into whatever comes after, carried by everyone who has ever needed a voice that sounded like honesty rather than performance, like someone who had been afraid and had walked through the door anyway. That is, in the end, what the pavement taught him. Not that the fear disappears, not that the world always responds, but that the music was always on the other side of the door, that it had always been waiting, that the only thing required was to walk through, and he walked through.